Hello, my name is Corey and I would like to welcome you back to the Clater house. In today's video, I am very excited to share this transformation of some IKEA Billy bookcases into a custom built-in library wall. This was a very special project in a very personal, special room to me for a very special client who happens to be a close family member. For this project, I drew a lot of inspiration from a design by Park and Oak, particularly their use of the dark wood of the interior of these upper shelves, paired with the white exterior and the storage along the bottom protruding out to create a counter that delineated between closed storage and the open shelving above. While I couldn't replicate every detail due to working with Billy bookcases, and nor did I want to with it being another designer's design, however, we did want to capture the essence of the built-in in their project, and I strategically used paint to capture the key elements that we most appreciated and make this fit into our rich, earthy palette. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss when I upload the full makeover of this room, but today we're gonna dive into this building process. The client already had 3 of these, so we only had to purchase 2 new bookcases and all of the doors for along the bottom. Now, we could have left the back of these, however, I didn't know how it was gonna take the paint, and also I didn't wanna see the lines from where it previously had come folded. So before starting this, I had painted the wall behind these in the color that these bookshelves were eventually going to be, so that the wall could serve as the back of the bookshelves. With the backs removed, I could then go in and fill in the 1/4 inch gap that was supposed to hold the backs. I used Drydex spackling to do this, and I also filled in all of the holes for the pegs of the shelves. We didn't want the capability for the shelves to move. We set them in the place that we liked it and then filled the rest of the holes for the support pegs. I also did this in the extender units up top, filling in those same shelf peg holes. I ended up using 2 coats of the spackling, and although the spackling worked great, if I were to do it again, I would probably use joint compound instead. Once the spackling was dry, I could take everything outside to sand it down. I started with 150 grit sandpaper, followed that up with 180 grit sandpaper, and then finished with 220. I sanded this, yes, to smooth out the spackling, but also to rough up all of the surface around these since they were getting painted. I wanted the surface to be ready for the primer and paint to stick to it. Once again, in addition to doing it on the bookshelves, I also did it on all of the extender units as well, sanding every surface that was going to get painted. With everything sanded, it was time to prime and paint these. I used my favorite primer, the Zinsser Ben 123 shellac-based primer, and I did 2 coats on both the extenders and the shelving units themselves. I then painted everything out with the color Rojo Marron by Sherwin Williams in a satin finish. Although I did 2 coats of primer, I ended up needing to do 3 coats of the paint to make sure it was really well covered and there was no white showing through this brownish red color. One part we were not painting red was the very bottom shelf that we were trying to make look like a counter. As I mentioned, we had previously painted the ceiling and all of the walls in the room, but I did go in and touch up the paint just back behind the top part of these units. I then repeated that same priming and painting process on all of the shelves. 2 coats of primer and a total of 3 coats of the Rojo Marron paint. It was then time to secure these units to the wall, and I just used the same hardware that these units came with. I started with the middle one, lining the middle of that unit up with the center of our room. I attached 1 bracket just to hold it in place, while I then did 2 along each of the sides. I made sure to use wall anchors so it was really secured into the wall. Although the instructions specify just using one of these brackets, I had enough to do 2 on each one, and to make sure that these are really secure, I made sure to do 2. Once my 2 were in place, I removed that center bracket and then moved down to the bottom of our units and secured it in the middle along the very bottom shelf that would be hidden by the doors. With them attached to the wall, I also used 1 1/4 inch cabinet screws to screw the cabinets together. I did 2 along the bottom of one side, and then on the other side of where 2 cabinets met, I did 2 along the top to make sure they were really secure together in 2 different directions. Anywhere where there were gaps where the units met the wall along the back, I used caulk to make sure everything seemed as if it was one piece. I then painted over that caulk with 2 coats of that same Rojo Marron paint. I then put all of the shelves back in the units so that we could prep for trim, because as you can see, there are several gaps along the sides and top, and we really want to make this look built into the wall. Working my way from the top down, I started with a 1x6 board. The gap along the top of our unit was about 4 to 4.5 inches. So this 1x6 hung down just a little bit past the top of the unit, which is exactly what I wanted. I ended up using 2 8-foot boards, and just like in the playroom/office makeover that you've seen me do in the past, I used a scarf joint to join these 2 boards for a more seamless transition. To nail this up, I used 2-inch nails, making sure that when I was nailing into the bookcases, I was going straight in, and then along the ceiling, I was nailing up at an angle. I then moved on to the vertical trim that was covering up where 2 units butted up next to one another. While a 1x2 would have been the exact width of this, I opted for a 1x4 board to create more substance and really make these feel like a nice, sturdy bookcase rather than just IKEA furniture. However, I didn't take these boards all the way to the bottom. I only measured to the bottom of our middle shelf because I didn't want to hinder the way that our doors will hinge when we put those on. I also used 2-inch nails for this, being very careful not to send the nails out at an angle so that they wouldn't come through the side of our unit. I then worked on the vertical pieces along the bottom where the doors were gonna be. Because the thickness of the units were 3/4 of an inch, they were 1.5 inches butted right up next to each other. So a 1x2, which is technically a 3/4 inch by 1.5 inch, was the exact width of 2 of these units butted up next to each other. So nailing these in place wouldn't hinder the movement of our doors. It does look a little weird where these 2 sizes of trim meet with all these weird angles, but you won't see this when the doors are actually on. I then moved on to trimming out the front of our shelves. Again, this was for substance, so these shelves looked thicker and not just like a Billy bookcase, but also I put LED strip lighting along the bottom front of these shelves, and I wanted to use trim to cover up the diffusion channels for those because the aluminum of the channels would not necessarily aid our aesthetic vision for these beautiful bookshelves. And with the channels being 3/4 inches thick and our shelves being 3/4 inches thick, the same 1x2 boards were the exact width to cover the shelves and the diffusion channels. Even along our bottom shelf, we're not adding LEDs inside of these doors, but there would be a weird gap between that bottom shelf and those doors. So I even added a 1x2 all along the bottom there to help close that gap and make that bottom shelf just as deep as all the ones above it. I could then add our bottom trim piece, but I first had to scribe out where the baseboard and the quarter round was along the sides of the unit. Using a jigsaw worked great for this, and any small gaps that were left, I was able to just fill with caulk to make it look seamless later. The size of this trim was a 1x5 board, just like along the top. It gave a little bit of a lip above the very bottom shelf, but that's gonna be covered by our doors anyway. Similar to the top, I had to use 2 8-foot pieces to fill the whole stretch of the unit, and I once again used a scarf joint to help make it look more seamless. Next, I could install the diffusion channels for our LED strip lighting. Although these cut with a miter saw, as you can see, I definitely would not try to cut more than one at a time. Luckily, I was okay, but this did end up slightly bending some of these channels, which caused some issues later. However, cutting them one by one definitely worked much better. I first drilled a small pilot hole in the bottom of the shelf and then came in with the screw provided to attach the bracket in place. And then the channel could just snap right into that bracket that held it really nicely. I chose a 45-degree angle diffusion strip rather than one that would shine the light straight down or straight forward because I wanted the whole shelf and everything on it to get illuminated really nicely. And the choice to do diffusion strips all together was so that we had a nice diffused light rather than each of the LED bulbs casting a spotlight on the items in front of it. And once those aluminum pieces were in, I could go in and wood fill all of our nail holes. And here on this top right shelf, you can see what I was talking about with how the saw caused the aluminum to bend a little bit. And this channel now curves down below where that trim is. And that's something I still haven't figured out how to fix. I continued applying wood filler to all of my nail holes as well as my scarf joints on the top and the bottom. And while that wood filler dried, I went in with a thick drill bit, and along the top of the channels, I drilled a hole from one unit into the other so that I could feed my LED strips through those. With those holes drilled, I was able to feed my LEDs through from one side of the unit all the way to the other. Each one of the shelves was an individual strip. So with 4 shelves being lit up, I had 4 LED strips running all the way from left to right. While I initially recommended an electrician for this part of the project, it was a little bit out of the budget, and the client found these LED strips off of Amazon. They were very affordable, but I don't know how long they'll end up lasting, so I don't know quite yet whether I would fully recommend them or not. But for the installation of this project, they worked really well. Since they're not hardwired, they can plug in to an outlet, and to make sure each one of these strips had power, I drilled a hole under the bottom left shelf at the top in the back so that I could feed all 4 of the cords through to give power to each of the strips. This is why I had not put trim up along this side quite yet. I also used a small drill bit at the very front of the shelves where the cord came out from the side of the cabinets to create a hole the exact width of the cord. I then took my multi-tool and cut out a channel to meet that hole so that the cords could slip right in without the need for a larger hole. The trim covered this up so you don't see these grooves once that's applied. There's an outlet in that bottom left-hand side cabinet that a power strip is plugged into so that each one of these strips could be plugged in at the same place. With the LEDs in, I could finally finish the trim along the sides. I was able to use one 1x4 board, and these boards along the sides were the only ones I had to trim down. I made sure along the top it overhung the same as all of the other vertical pieces along the top did. And then along the bottom, I trimmed it down so that there was no overhang to block the hinge of our doors. While I could have used a table saw for this, the wall was a little uneven and I hate using the table saw, so I found that a jigsaw, although it took longer, worked better for me. I used the same 2-inch nails to attach these, making sure to nail straight into the unit and then at an angle into the wall. And then on the side with the LEDs, I didn't put in very many nails. One, because I didn't want to risk hitting any of the cords, but also I wanted these particular boards to be able to come off really easily in the event that these cords ever needed to be accessed. So there really was only 2 or 3 nails in both the bottom piece as well as the top piece. I then finished up the LED lighting by taking the adhesive backing off of the LED strip and making sure that I stuck the strip to the 45-degree angle of the channel. And then the diffusion cover, because it was made of plastic, was really easy to trim down with scissors, and those pieces just snapped right into place in the channels. Each of these strips was 15 feet long, but our wall was only like 13.5 feet. So when I got to the ends, I made sure to just cut with the scissors right along where the instructions told me I could cut if I needed to. With those finally done, I had to test if they worked, and thankfully they did, and they could be controlled with just one remote rather than 4 for each one of the strips. With our LEDs done, it was finally time to put the finishing touches on these bookshelves. I caulked all along the sides and along the top to make sure there was a seamless transition from wall to bookshelves to give us a really built-in look rather than having a bunch of gaps. And I then went in with the same Zinsser Ben 123 shellac-based primer. I did 2 coats all over the trim and then followed that up with 2 coats of the color Creamy by Sherwin Williams in a satin finish. Now, this color was just on all of the trim along the outside and then our vertical pieces, as well as our very bottom shelf that we're trying to make look like a countertop. Since I couldn't build the bottom of these out due to them being a Billy bookcase, one way I helped create the illusion of a counter, like in our inspiration, was through paint. By painting it the same color as the doors and the trim, it didn't make it seem like it was part of the bookshelves and rather like it was a countertop. These bookshelves were painted in the same color as the walls and the ceiling, and the finish matched the finish of the walls, which, like I said, was a satin finish. I repeated these same steps with 2 coats of primer and 2 coats of paint on all of the cabinet doors. And the only thing I forgot to do with the doors was sand them down. And I wish I would not have forgotten that step, because before sealing them, they were prone to peeling and chipping more than the bookshelves that were sanded before I primed and painted them. I could then go in and paint all of our shelves and finish up that beautiful brown red color. To make sure I didn't get any red on our freshly painted white, I edged out along the vertical pieces with an artist's paintbrush rather than a painter's edging paintbrush. And then I applied 3 coats of that Rojo Marron paint in a satin finish so that the trim applied along the front of our shelves matched the color of our shelves. I could then put my Oxberg doors along the bottom of my units. Because I added 3/4 inch trim to the front of these, I had to move the holes for my hinges 3/4 inches forward. So I started by taping off with painter's tape and used a level to mark a line from the specified holes in the instructions that were initially meant to be used for the hinges. I used a speed square to mark 3/4 inches further forward, and then once again used a level to transfer that marking from the bottom line to the top line, so they were both the exact same amount forward from the initial holes. I then drilled a couple of pilot holes and screwed these brackets into place. I then put the hinges on the doors, slid them onto our brackets, and screwed them all together. Now, I tried to be as precise as possible, but these hinges are able to adjust in all directions, so there was a little bit of wiggle room in the event of any small errors. I repeated this same process on all 10 of the doors. To make these even more custom, I opted not to use the original hardware that the Oxberg doors come with and selected a more substantial, different style cabinet pull. To mark the placement for it, I used a speed square lined up with the bottom of the top rail and marked right in the center of the style. I then measured 6.3 inches down the door, because that was the distance between the holes on my handles, and made sure that bottom measurement was also in the center of the style before I went in and drilled both of the holes. This is one instance where I was talking about the paint peeling on the doors. Initially, I tried to do this with a piece of tape as a template, and when I drilled through, it created an edge for the paint, and the tape ripped the paint right off of the door. So on one of the doors, I did have to touch up the paint and abandon the idea of using tape on the rest of them. To help prevent the paint from chipping and scratching, I decided to seal these bookshelves, and if you've watched my 2 previous vlogs, you'll realize that this is where I made a huge mistake by using oil-based sealer, which ruined all of my white paint. It turned my white paint this ugly greenish yellow color. I totally meant to initially use water-based sealer, but accidentally grabbed oil-based sealer at the store and then proceeded to ignore all of the signs that pointed to it being oil-based sealer. So to fix this, I sanded all of the white paint down with 220 grit sandpaper so the paint and primer once again had a good surface to adhere to. I re-primed with 2 coats of the same Zinsser Ben 123 shellac-based primer, repainted with 2 coats of the color Creamy by Sherwin Williams in a satin finish, and then resealed it with water-based sealer. I did 2 coats on all of the trim pieces, but on that very bottom white shelf, I ended up doing 3 coats of sealer. I repeated the same sanding, priming, and painting process on all of the doors as well, also using 3 coats of the same water-based sealer. However, on all of the red paint, I did choose to use an oil-based sealer. Oil-based sealer tends to be more durable and last longer, and with these top shelves having books slid on and off them more often, I wanted them to be more durable, and I actually liked the way the oil-based sealer affected the color of these shelves. For both the water-based and the oil-based sealer, I used the Minwax Helmsman Spar Urethane Indoor-Outdoor Sealer. Just on the red paint, I used the oil-based, and on all of the white paint, I used the water-based. With my mistake fixed and these shelves sealed, I could finally put back on my handles and finish up these bookshelves. These handles are from Etsy. They come in a couple of different sizes, but I chose the 6.3 inch measurement from hole to hole in an antique brass color. I'll discuss the design choice behind these handles a little bit more in my final makeover video, but once I put these handles on all 10 doors, this project was finally finished. And that's it. Our built-in is finally finished. It feels so good to have this done. I'm so happy with the way that it turned out. The way that the shelves are styled are just kind of temporary. I wanted to get everything up and just have it in there to kind of get the full effect of it. But when I do the full makeover of this room, which will be coming very soon, I will more meticulously go in and style these. This is a home library, so I really wanted to focus on that. I don't want to go overboard on decor shopping, like to buy things that don't already exist in this home. I want to keep the items sentimental. A lot of these books are sentimental. Books for people in general are sentimental. So I wanted to keep a lot of the items as well in that same vein. I think a home library is a great place to get eclectic and show off some of your more personal items. Now there are some empty shelves. There's some more books on the way, but all of this will get restyled and we'll try to incorporate some of those books and maybe even leave some empty spaces for this library to grow. I hope you enjoyed this Billy bookcase hack. In the upcoming makeover series, we are turning to the rest of the room and I'll dive into the design of the space overall, including these bookshelves. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up. If you have any questions, please leave those in the comments below. And if you haven't already, please subscribe so you don't miss that upcoming makeover series. I have 2 more DIYs to do in this room, but they're on a little bit smaller scale, so make sure you come back for those as well. Until next time, I am wishing you all my best. Let's make this ottoman.
Won't you stay? Won't you stay?
In one of my recent vlogs, we found this beautiful green-brown fabric.